Hello, everyone. Welcome to the lecture about creating a cultural identity in the new United States. Three questions to think about. Why was it important for the United States to create a cultural identity? What events shaped the formation of the United States cultural identity? And then how is this identity visible in the art, literature, and music of the early Republic era? We've talked about the creation of a political identity for the new nation in terms of the basic political ideals the founders struggled to institutionalize, first through the Articles of Confederation, and ultimately through the writing, debating, and ratification of the Constitution. This political identity is one aspect of a broader cultural identity of the nation. A nation's cultural identity is really its personality. The cultural identity of a nation can include its material culture, things like clothing, furniture, accessories, for example, its artistic culture, art, music, literature, its intellectual culture, ideas that are printed in newspapers or become the subject of lecture material or nonfiction books. It can include its cuisine. It can also include religious, political, and social culture. All of these elements contribute to a greater sense of a nation's overall identity. And I want to examine a few examples of the people, events, and circumstances that contributed to the growth of an American cultural identity. First, it's important to recognize that by the end of the Revolution, leaders and ordinary American citizens were eager to have a unique American culture that they could celebrate, be proud of, and that would distinguish them from the British. While the formation of political institutions might have been the most urgent and important task, the Americans needed to, quote, unbecome British in other ways. It was important to do this for a variety of reasons. One, a sense of cultural identity would help to transcend the state-level differences that persisted. It would unify Americans across the states and therefore help create domestic policy. Two, a sense of cultural identity would position the new nation more firmly internationally, so it would help with foreign policy. Three, creating a cohesive cultural identity would give Americans a shared understanding of their nation's uniqueness, a sense of ownership and pride in their nation's distinct talents, and a way of thinking of themselves as different from Britain and from the rest of the world. In some ways, attempts to create a cohesive cultural identity were deliberate, and in other ways, they just evolved or emerged. So I want to talk specifically about three events that helped shape America's cultural identity during the early years of the Republic. And then we'll look at some of the cultural production from this era that was influenced by these events. The first example relates to political culture. One of the goals of the first presidential administration was to avoid the creation of what they called factions, which to us is political parties. President Washington made Alexander Hamilton the Secretary of the Treasury, General Henry Knox Secretary of War, and Thomas Jefferson Secretary of State. Hamilton and Jefferson disagreed intensely about all of the critical issues. The first had to do with the size and scope of the federal government. Hamilton, pictured here, wanted a strong central government, a large administration that could control factions by having a lot of authority. He considered the common people to be ignorant and incapable of self-government. He believed that the elite should rule, so there should be high voting qualifications. Hamilton and his followers became known as the Federalists. They were mostly merchants, bankers, and manufacturers, with some wealthy farmers and southern plantation owners. They were mostly well-educated and owned property. Most of them lived in New England and along the coast. They also believed that one of the roles of government should be to support efforts to create a commercial economy. Thomas Jefferson, here, held an opposite set of views. He believed the federal government should be small and should support a rural agrarian nation. He believed that every man should vote. Jefferson and his followers became known as the Democratic Republicans. Jefferson's cohorts were mostly artisans, shopkeepers, frontier settlers, backcountry farmers, and poor farmers. They were more often ill-educated and illiterate, and the majority of them were settled in the interior regions. Jefferson himself, of course, was a plantation owner who was very well educated. One of the biggest areas of controversy between these two groups was whether the government should be involved with banking. Hamilton wanted the government to assume responsibility for the Revolutionary War debt and to establish a national bank. A national bank, he felt, would provide a safe place for the government to keep money, make loans to businesses and government, and issue banknotes. Further, he wanted the bank to be able to sell some of its stock to individual citizens. This would be good for investors in the bank. He believed that it was authorized by the Constitution because it was necessary and proper. Jefferson said a national bank was not necessary and that it was not authorized under the Constitution. He felt that a bank would benefit commercial classes and not the farmers. So the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans were deeply divided over this issue. A compromise was finally reached where the Democratic Republicans would support Hamilton's banking ideas if they got to pick the location of the permanent national political capital. It sounds like apples and oranges, right? That they're not really equivalent. But this situation reveals several important aspects to the emerging political culture. First, you have these political factions divided along lines of geography, class, and profession. Second, you have a very important political symbolism of the capital city. Each faction wanted the national capital to be in close proximity to its own political base. They felt it gave their faction more prestige or more power or more opportunity for long-term profit. Washington actually chose the final site, and he chose the banks of the Potomac for a variety of reasons. He liked the site for its easy access to many parts of the expanding country through its waterways. He had grown up nearby, so he had a sentimental attachment to the area, and his own estate, Mount Vernon, was nearby. He worked with a man named Pierre L'Enfant, an architect from France, to design the entire city. This is a picture of L'Enfant's design. He and others believed that even if they were all just sort of making up this government as they went along, they could at least look as if they knew what they were doing. And that is why, when L'Enfant envisioned a grand, glorious city, Washington agreed. He knew that building a big, bold, beautiful city of solid stone, a city that could eventually hold its own with London or Paris, would let the world know that the people of the United States of America were serious and that they were here to stay. And so this is a really important message that the United States wanted to send to the world. In his farewell address, President Washington warned about devolving into separate political parties. He advised the nation to strive for unity. But Thomas Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans believed that Hamilton and the Federalists were acting in ways reminiscent of the British government's tyranny. Both groups, Federalists and Democratic Republicans, started to work to gain more supporters, to gain more votes, etc. And this became known then as the first political party, the first party system. So that's example number one. Example number two relates to the physical space of America and how that contributed and played a role in the development of a cultural identity. Thomas Jefferson served 2 terms as president. His vision was that America should be a society of yeoman farmers, an agrarian community with limited commercialization and a limited government. As he approached his second term, events in France inadvertently fueled his vision. Napoleon Bonaparte had made himself the ruler of France, and he wanted to restore the French Empire to the greatness it had once had. To do that, he thought he needed to recreate a presence in North America. If you remember, the huge Louisiana territory had been given to Spain after the French and Indian War. So Napoleon entered into a secret treaty with Spain to get back the Louisiana territory in 1800. And then in 1802, he and the French government in New Orleans passed a law that forbade American ships from dropping their cargoes in New Orleans on their way from the Mississippi River to ocean-going vessels. So he's preventing American merchants from getting to the ocean, and this is one of the ways Napoleon Bonaparte was trying to create a strong presence in his territory in the Americas. So Jefferson was in a bind. If he tried to force the issue with France, he risked war with France. But if he ignored the issue, he risked losing support from American shippers in that region. So he came up with an idea of sending Robert Livingston, the ambassador to Paris, to negotiate for the purchase of the port of New Orleans. Livingston decided on his own to negotiate for the purchase of the entire Louisiana territory. Behind the scenes, Jefferson had built up his armed forces and hinted around that the United States was prepared for war if it came to that. Napoleon recently came to the conclusion that he actually didn't want his empire to expand to America. So he decided that he would, in fact, offer the entire Louisiana territory to the United States. So the United States purchased the Louisiana territory for the small sum of $15 million for 828,000 square miles. It really actually was a bargain. It would be somewhere in the trillions to make that purchase today. Jefferson was at first not certain that he could actually make this purchase under the Constitution, but his advisors convinced him that he could. So Congress approved the acquisition, the territory was divided into potential states, and the first Louisiana was admitted to the Union a few years later, 1812. So several things are worth noting about this purchase. First, despite Jefferson's worry about whether he had the power to buy land, the acquisition of such a vast territory certainly did contribute to his goal for an agrarian society. Second, the fact that Congress eagerly approved the purchase reveals their hunger for more land as well. Jefferson had already been planning to mount an exploration of the rest of the continent, and now that became even more important and urgent. He chose his personal secretary, Meriwether Lewis, an intelligent and literate man who also possessed skills as a frontiersman, to lead an expedition across the new territory. Lewis, in turn, solicited the help of William Clark, whose abilities as a frontiersman were even stronger. Lewis, in fact, so highly respected Clark that he made him a co-commanding captain of the expedition, even though the government never recognized Clark's role as such. Together, they created a diverse military corps of discovery, they called it, to undertake a 2-year journey to try to get to the Pacific Ocean. In the spring of 1804, they set off the map of their journey. They traveled along the Missouri River to a place called Fort Mandan, trading post, where they set up camp, wintered, and prepared for the journey to the Pacific. In the spring of 1805, they resumed their travels, and then they returned from the expedition in 1806. Along the way, they traded goods with the Indians they encountered and set up diplomatic relations with a few of the tribes. Additionally, they recorded their contact with the Indians and described and drew the shape of the landscape, the creatures of the Western world, lots of things that were new to them in this area. The expedition of the Corps of Discovery shaped a very crude route to the waters of the Pacific and marked an initial pathway for the new nation to spread westward from ocean to ocean, fulfilling many of Jefferson's wishes for the expedition and outlining what would become to many Americans an obvious manifest destiny. And we'll talk more about that later. The idea being that Americans were destined to overspread, as they use the word, the entire continent from East Coast to West Coast, that this was somehow God's mandate for Americans, was to really cross the entire continent, to own it, to conquer it, to inhabit it. And so this becomes a very important part of America's cultural identity. When the expedition returned in 1806, the first member to publish his journals was Sergeant Patrick Gass, with the help of a school teacher named David McKeon, who helped him with the editing. The markets and the timing of the publication of this journal were great. The country was excited to read about the newly returned expedition and about the discoveries and the knowledge that the explorers brought back. The gas edition of the Lewis and Clark journals went through several printings within the United States. It was also translated into German and French and was also printed in England. Another set of editions from Lewis and Clark's papers were published 7 years later. Even then, 7 years later, the nation was still interested and excited to read more, and thousands of people were intrigued enough to venture west themselves. They were inquisitive about the land, about the idea of exploration, and about the possibilities both presented for personal success and wealth. So the meaning of land and the ability to explore it, acquire it, and settle in new areas became a very important aspect of American cultural identity. This is an image excerpt from the Lewis and Clark journals. The third contributor to American cultural identity that I want to talk a little bit about is the War of 1812. There are three factors that contributed to the development of this war. The first relates to the naval policies of France and Britain. In Europe at this time, the Napoleonic Wars were being waged. Both sides, the British and the French, tried to ensure that the United States could not help the other side. Particularly, they each made it impossible for US merchants to bring their goods to either French or British ports. The British compounded the problem through the practice of impressment. Now, what this meant was that if the British thought that any deserters from their own merchant ships were on a United States merchant ship, they could stop that ship in the ocean to try to impress, which really meant sort of, it's like arresting the deserters from their own merchant marines. This bothered American merchants, politicians, and the public in general, and it came to a head when a British ship opened fire on an American ship that would not surrender its British deserters. Neither Jefferson nor his successor, James Madison, wanted a war with Britain or France, so they each tried to solve this problem by passing congressional acts that would keep American ships away from the British and French ports. But these measures ended up hurting American merchants. And while France eventually stopped interfering with American ships, Britain did not, which really created higher tensions between the United States and Britain. The second factor contributing to the war was that the British at this point were also afraid that the United States was preparing to invade Canada, which was a British territory. So the British created an alliance with a Native American leader named Tecumseh. The United States government felt that the only way to make the West safe for Americans would in fact be to drive the British out of Canada. Third factor, in the South, Americans wanted to take Florida from Spain, another land acquisition. In 1810, under President Madison, American settlers seized a Spanish fort at Baton Rouge and asked Madison for aid acquiring the rest of Florida. And Madison was willing to help. This is how important land was already. Since Spain was Britain's ally, this added to the reasons to go to war with Britain. By 1812, all of these issues were creating significant war fever throughout the country. And on June 18th of 1812, Madison approved a congressional declaration of war against Britain. Britain initially ignored the declaration of war because it was still embroiled in conflict with France. But when France's army was decimated by Russia, Britain turned its attention to America. And Britain initially was successful. In fact, for more than a year, the British Army was victorious over the United States. But finally, in 1813, the United States was able to drive the British back into Canada. Tecumseh was killed. The British gained the upper hand again and burned the capital city to the ground. Luckily, James Madison's wife, Dolly, was able to save important papers from the executive mansion. One key battle against the Creek Indians was led by Andrew Jackson, his troops, and a band of Cherokee warriors. This was the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in 1814, which took place in Alabama. 800 Cherokee warriors were slaughtered, and a treaty was signed between the United States and the Creek, which caused the Creek to lose over 2/3 of their land. but the United States was no closer to winning the war. In June of 1814, the British did defeat Napoleon, finally ending the Napoleonic Wars. Thousands of British troops were sent to New Orleans to continue the fighting against the United States. But strangely, in December, the British and United States representatives decided to negotiate a peace settlement, and this was not clear to the troops who were actually fighting. In New Orleans, under General Andrew Jackson, the United States troops secured a major victory before news of the peace settlement reached them. And because they had secured this victory, Jackson became a national hero, which would really help him later in his political career. But even more importantly, this was really important to America's growing cultural identity, because the results of the war were as follows. First of all, there were no territorial gains for either side, except for the land that the United States took from the Indians. But Jackson's victory made it look like the United States had won. So the war emphasized America's independence from Britain. America's independence from Britain would never again be questioned because of the war. The war also gave the United States international prestige. It secured a new respect for this infant republic among the powers of Europe. So to conclude, as the United States identity started to solidify, a few cultural themes emerged. One was a political culture that was very divisive, with two parties representing very different visions for the country. Another was the culture relating to the physical space of the country, the beauty of the land, the expansiveness of the land, and the availability of the land all became important symbols of the United States. Of course, this assumed that the Native Americans would be willing to share or give up their land. So this vision and this identity does not apply to everyone. And last, the War of 1812 added a sense of national pride, power, and even invincibility to the growing national identity. And all of these characteristics are evident in the literature, the music, and the art of this period. And we will look at those things when we meet in person. So that concludes this lecture. Thank you.